To the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:09 p.m. in one of the darkest, grimmest, most dismal, most depressing days since last week, I guess. There's no sun, there's no daylight. Everything is clouded in this all-encompassing grayness before this grayness then disappears into a perpetual blackness. So it's not a cheerful sight. However, on a more cheerful note, thank you everybody who has joined me for the Gaggle live stream. And it's kind of a very unusual day because we had the South Korean president who seems to have gone bonkers. Just out of the blue, earlier today he declared martial law, and then the National Assembly said that no, this is not acceptable. They refused to enact his decree, but he still continued saying, no, martial law. And the military said, well, it's martial law, it's martial law. To justify his martial law, the South Korean president mumbled something about the threat from North Korea and all these North Korean agents that were running around in South Korea. And then he couldn't get anywhere with his legislative agenda because the parliament is under the control of the opposition. And he's also extremely unpopular. You know, his poll ratings are something like around 17, 18%. You know, makes Biden seem quite popular. But now, I think within the last couple of hours, it seems that he has lifted the martial law, and he has yet to address the South Korean people. I mean, it's a little early in the morning there. I'm not sure. I think it's about 5 in the morning in South Korea. So, but it isn't clear whether he is actually going to address the South Korean people, or whether he's just going to resign, or maybe he'll just be carried out in a straitjacket. He kind of reminds me a little bit of the Woody Allen's film Bananas, where that after the coup, the leader of the coup started issuing all kinds of loony decrees, and then Woody Allen says something like, you know, what's Spanish for straitjacket, and so here again you could say, well, what's Korean for straitjacket. So I have my doubts whether he's going to survive. I think he will be. I think he'll just be removed from power. I mean, it's just a clear sign of mental instability, which is quite common in South Korea. I mean, there have been a lot of shooters, for instance, the mass shooters in the United States. A number of them were of Korean extraction, and South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. I mean, it's a very, very, very impressive. So I think South Korea is, I think, you know, either number one or number two, but South Korea is right up there in terms of suicide rate. So you know, the kind of mental instability is not that uncommon in South Korea. But it's always been very amusing because this has always been known about South Korea, but the idolatry that has surrounded South Korea during the Cold War. I mean, we were always told that the North Koreans were loonies. You know, Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Un and so on. But North Korea was actually a model of stability, in comparison with South Korea. So in South Korea, PG Tips puts 34 there. I wonder what 34 represents. But anyway, it says 34. Okay. And but in comparison with South Korea, they had all these military coups. They had a lot of violence in South Korea. I mean, they had military dictatorships for many years, and and then of course you also had the all sorts of financial crises in South Korea. So I've always just been kind of amusing. The kind of the official dictum that somehow North Korea is this extraordinarily unstable state, whereas South Korea is this model democracy, which of course it's never been the case. So we'll see how it happens. My feeling is that the South Korean president will be announcing his resignation within the next 24 hours. I mean, I think he can't survive after making such a jackass of himself today. But meanwhile, back in the United States, I'm kind of baffled by the response to the Hunter Biden pardon. It always seemed to me the most predictable event that would take place was that Joe Biden, before he leaves office, will pardon Hunter. The president has these pardon powers, and there is nothing in the Constitution to say that a president cannot pardon his son, his nephew, his mother, his father, or anyone. So John Potter says Reverend Son Young Moon. Yeah, that was a nutty group there to start with. With those strange mass marriages and so on. So that's a very weird cult. So that was I mean, Biden acted in entirely an understandable and humane way. He pardoned his son. Now, obviously, his son had committed crimes. He had been found guilty. The crimes were reasonably serious, and of course, there were far greater crimes that he hadn't been prosecuted for. So, for instance, he was clearly had violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act. He was obviously working as an agent on behalf of a variety of governments. He was engaging in influence peddling, making money simply on account of being the son of an important person in Washington. And so, those were more serious crimes. And then on his laptop, there were I mean, I haven't really gone through the laptop myself. It didn't interest me that much. But people who have gone through the laptop say that there were some serious issues there that he could have been prosecuted for, and there would have been quite serious crimes, and that his father would not have been able to pardon him for. But given that tax issues, falsely filling out a gun registration form, those things that you can. It's not so horrific to pardon him. But I think even if he had been more serious crimes, if I'm sure Biden would have pardoned his son. So I really don't know what's the point of this agitation, other than they sense that when Trump assumes the office on January the 20th, he is going to pardon right away a number of people. I think he's going to pardon the January 6th defendants, pretty much all of them. I would have thought. I mean, he might go easy. Well, not pardon anyone who has been committed of who has been convicted of a violent crime, but he might even pardon them because the violence was in the context of excessive police force, and often they were just simply responding to the brutality of the police, particularly as the police were using excessive force against women. And so when that happens, men kind of lose their heads and do stupid things. And so I think there was a lot of that. The police were using extraordinary brutality against some of the women, beating them over the head with their truncheons and so on. So I think some of the men got very, very agitated and started hitting the police in response. So I think Trump is likely to pardon them early on. At least I hope so, because you have to say he was quite stingy with the pardons during his first term. I think that he should have pardoned Michael Flynn very early on. He should have pardoned Roger Stone very early on. He should have pardoned Paul Manafort very early on. He should have pardoned Steve Bannon very early on. Instead, he left it all really to the last moment. Now, they were all of those cases were quite egregious because, Michael Flynn really didn't do anything wrong. I mean, Trump wronged Flynn by firing him. It was a ridiculous, outrageous thing for Trump to do because he hadn't done anything wrong. The idea that somehow Mike Pence claimed that Flynn had lied to him. Well, Pence is a moron, and there's no particular reason why Trump should have believed Pence. But he believed, he lied to me. He didn't lie to him. Pence kind of misunderstood clearly what Flynn had said. But either way, Flynn was a far more important person within his administration. He's his national security advisor than his moronic vice president was. And then, of course, the vice president, appropriately, this always happens with Trump. The person that you took his side, and then he, of course, stabbed you in the back on January the 6th. So that's that after having done that against Flynn, but the idea was always ridiculous. I mean, a vice president is nothing; it's a ceremonial position. It's nothing, and he's the guy you send to represent you at the funeral of some obscure prime minister somewhere. And imagine if there was a conflict between Henry Kissinger and, say, Vice President Spiro Agnew, and then Nixon said, "Well, hey, Henry, you lied to Spiro Agnew. I'm afraid I have to cut off my dealings with you." I mean, it's absurd. But he left Flynn twisting in the wind, and then of course these creatures, the Comey and his gang, brought these criminal charges against Flynn. Clearly a fraud, clearly bogus charges that he had somehow lied to the FBI. He hadn't. And then when there was a new leadership. This went on for a long time, and then so when Bill Barr took over as Attorney General, they wanted to drop the charges against Flynn, and then the Judge Sullivan, this absolute clown, crazy, idiotic judge, and there's full of those people in the United States. So this guy, he said, no, yeah, I'm not going to accept you dropping these charges. This case goes on. So the prosecutor and the defense attorney had agreed, we're going to drop these charges against Flynn, and then the Judge Sullivan, says, nah, the case goes forward. It's, quite, totally insane. That's not the role of a judge. The judge is just supposed to preside over a trial and ensure fair play. He's not supposed to take over the prosecution. He's not the captain of the prosecution team. But that went on and on and on, costing Flynn an arm and a leg. I mean, I don't think Flynn, as a retired general, is a particularly wealthy man. But Trump really took his sweet time about pardoning him, and then Manafort. So the point is, why did they go after Flynn? Why did they go after Flynn? But because Flynn was working for Trump. Flynn was Trump's first national security advisor, and so that's why they went after Flynn. Why did they go after Paul Manafort? Well, they went after Paul Manafort because he had been Trump's campaign manager. This is all fairly obvious. After all these so-called crimes that Manafort had committed, it was all a long time ago. Why the sudden urgency to go after Manafort now? Well, obviously, because they wanted to hit everybody who had been associated with Trump. And then, of course, they went after Bannon with that whole funding the wall charity, or whatever it was. So really, Trump, took his time about pardoning, and that's why, incidentally, I mean, I think there are people who are quite wary about these pardons from the January the 6th people. So they're saying, well, yeah, Trump talked about pardoning them during the campaign, but lately he hasn't really said much. So, we'll see what happens. Certainly, that was it was an egregious miscarriage of justice to go after the January the 6th people. They were there to protest the election. You could argue they were wrong-headed or whatever, but they were there to protest peacefully. Things went wrong, and then of course, when the government went after them, in the thousands, they prosecuted thousands of people, who, almost all of whom did not commit any acts of violence, but they prosecuted them, sent them to prison, some of them to many years in prison, and then they exploited this corrupt, sleazy entity called DC. This is the DC courts. They know the DC, which is 95% Democrat, they're going to absolutely find guilty anyone at all who's associated with Trump. I mean, that's it. Whether you're a supporter of Trump, you work for Trump, you like Trump, you will be found guilty. And the same, incidentally, applies to all the Watergate people. I mean, I remember at the time when just about every Watergate defendant was found guilty, thinking, well, that's amazing. You watch Perry Mason, and then lots of all these people keep getting off Perry Mason, but here absolutely everyone is found guilty. Well, yeah, because in DC, again, if you're a Republican, you have no hope of getting a fair trial, and this is again, I think it's an American disgrace. The whole DC courts, the DC circuit. I mean, there's no reason to keep this going. But yeah, I mean, so they were convicted. And Manafort was in prison. Roger Stone was sent to prison. And then Trump really didn't do very much. So we'll see whether he acts differently this time. I've been linking and I've been reading a little bit. I don't want to go into it too much. It doesn't interest me sufficiently. The case of Pete Hegseth and the various scandalous personal personal relations. Now, I don't necessarily think that having a a less than salubrious personal life should be a disqualification. But there are limits, I think. I mean, if you're going to be a defense secretary, and it turns out that you're basically a serial adulterer. So in other words, he's married to one woman, he's commits adultery with another woman, then he kind of ditches the first wife, marries a second wife, and then of course immediately commits adultery with second wife. Then he goes and marries the third one, and even as he does so, he's always impregnating all these women. So even and even in the scandal of the one that's been brought against him, the woman who claimed that that he assaulted her. Again, he could easily have impregnated her. I mean, that's part of the story, that they had unprotected sex. So he does have a kind of there's a certain pathology about him to be cheating on his wives and impregnating other women as he goes along. Now, again, you could say, well, that's not, that's got nothing to do with, his job as a defense secretary. Maybe not. On the other hand, it shows a really serious lack of judgment. It shows a really serious lack of respect and consideration for other people. And even that can always be overlooked if his qualifications were stronger. I mean, if you say, well, yeah, but this guy really knows, he's a 3-star general. He's been, he's been in every field of combat, around the world. Whatever his personal shortcomings, it's nothing when you weigh it against his rich military experience. Now, but he doesn't have any of that. First of all, he was in the National Guard. I mean, yes, he was in combat, but he was still the National Guard, so he wasn't really in the proper military. He doesn't have any real military experience. He's never held any senior military positions. He's never, written anything that's of importance and interest when it comes to military matters. He's not written any military history. He's not written any serious work on military strategy. And as I say, in terms of combat, I mean, he's still the National Guard. So what, then we can, of course, get into his nuttiness, his absolute lunacy when it comes to Israel. Really, really disgusting. I mean, to have these kinds of worshipful attitudes towards a foreign country, not your country, towards a foreign country, and he's not even a Jew. I mean, I just find it disgusting. When at least if you're a Jew, you can say, well, I mean, that's, I'm a Jew and I identify with Israel. It's not a strong argument, but at least you can say, well, it means a great deal to me. I have an emotional attachment to Israel as a Jew. I strongly believe in the homeland for the Jews. I don't live there. I don't have no intention of living there, but I believe strongly in a homeland for the Jews, and I'm a Jew myself. Okay, I think you can at least make that argument. But when you're not a Jew, and then you have this emotional attachment um, to this foreign state, talking about the rebuilding of the third temple, rebuilding the third temple. Even Israeli Jews don't talk about that. Then again, it's unlikely that you will be making rational choices on behalf of the country that you purport to represent, or whose military you will administer. So that, I think, is a disqualification. I think his lack of any real serious military experience, the kind of thoughtful, intelligent military experience, he doesn't have. As I say, he's not. He served in the National Guard. He didn't serve in the military. I mean, unlike Waltz. God, it's like ancient history. I was having difficulties remembering his name. Waltz, Mike Waltz. Is it? No, was it Waltz? Tim Waltz. Not Mike Waltz is the national incoming national security advisor. Tim Waltz, who never saw any combat. But anyway, so he at least did see combat. So, but again, National Guard. Um, his entire career is based on the fact that he took a nutty, view of the Iraq War. He was a kind of an Iraq War veteran who was a fervent supporter of the Iraq War, so much so that he actually was an advocate for the surge. So that's how he came to the attention of George W. Bush, and so that's how he got to be well known. Hey, well, because all the other veterans had turned against the Iraq War, and they didn't like being lied to about weapons of mass destruction. They thought they didn't appreciate the deceit that sent them to that cauldron. But no, that wasn't like him. He was absolutely gung ho, fervent supporter of the Iraq War. And there, you can see him in those pictures with George standing behind George W. Bush, saying, "Yeah, we got to support, the surge. We need a surge," which of course was all complete nonsense. Anyway, that helped to get him a job at Fox News, and of course he had I guess he had the looks. And then he had a kind of athletic build, and that helped him. Fox News and Trump. He values the people who appear on Fox News, and you have to just say, if you're on Fox News, if you're on television, Trump likes you. And that's how he came to Trump's attention. Now I know people we said that he was very pro-Ukraine, very anti-Russian. Of course, he holds that conventional view: the Russians are bad guys, and you plucky little Ukraine fighting for its freedom and so on. And then, of course, the point has been made. Yeah, but he changed his mind. More recently, I think, what was it? He's a neocon mugged by reality. I think something like that. He doesn't really think that anymore. Now, I'm not buying this story. I mean, I think this is an interventionist. I think he's a war hawk. As I say, this is a last stander when he came to Iraq. But he's also someone who is he knows which way he's not a fool. He knows which way the wind is blowing. And so, he, along with Mike Waltz, along with Marco Rubio, and along with all the neocons, or whatever we call them, to the extent that neocon even has any real meaning, all the neocons suddenly said, well, we're not, maybe we should rethink Ukraine. So I'm not, even Keith Kellogg has said this. This it's the flavor of the month. But anyway, he, to me, just doesn't seem that he has any of the right, I don't know, attributes that you need for that job. And again, and I've talked about this before. I am old enough to remember the older Bush, who was George H.W. Bush, and when he nominated as Defense Secretary John Tower of Texas. And everyone assumed this would be a shoo-in. John Tower, very respected senator, he was from Texas, and he would just waltz in. I mean, he's a senator after all. Of course, the senators are all going to support him. His good friend Sam Nunn from Georgia, he was going to support him. Everyone just assumed that that's going to be a walk in the park. And then they said, well, we can't have John Tower because he's been inebriated. He's been seen to be inebriated. He had one too many. And he's been seen in the company of women who were not his wife. And this was brought up. This was, on all the Sunday talk shows, you'd have people coming along, senators, talking in very stentorian tones, like as Sam Nunn used to do. I don't know if people remember Sam Nunn. What was that? Gravitas. But he said, yeah, these are very troubling accusations about John Tower. And then Tower, he made the disastrous mistake, which was to admit, yeah, I've had a problem with alcohol in the past. I did, imbibe one too many on more than one occasion, and I did spend time with loose women, but he said, I wasn't married at the time. I was single at the time, so that doesn't really count. I mean, I can hang out with loose women if I'm not married, can't I? But once you do that, and then I think he came on one of those Sunday talk shows and said something like, I'm prepared to sign a pledge that during my time as defense secretary, I will not let one drop of alcohol pass my lips. He was done. Once you do that, once you essentially admitted your culpability, you were finished. And he didn't have the votes. I can't remember whether I think a vote was taken. I think he lost the vote. Yeah, I think the votes. Yeah, he lost that vote. The funnily enough was there was one Democrat who voted for him, Senator Chris Dodd. I don't know if people remember him, but he only voted for Tower because his father, Thomas Dodd, had been censured by the Senate, and one of the people who had voted in favor of his father, Thomas Dodd, had been John Tower. And so Chris Dodd, in a very honorable way, repaid the debt on behalf of his father that he supported John Tower. But every single other Democrat, including his very good friend, Sam Nunn, they all voted against Tower. Anyway, my only point in bringing up John Tower was that he didn't commit any of the egregious things that Hexeth has been accused of. And again, I don't believe the story about the sexual assault. But again, the story about the sexual assault, as I said, I don't think that he assaulted her. Clearly, they had sexual relations, and then again, you have to ask his judgment. He has sexual relations with a married woman. It's not just that she's a married woman; she's there at this event at which he spoke. She's there at this event with her husband. What kind of a fool does that? So you have to think this is a guy who just lacks judgment. Leave aside all the weird tattoos that he has on his chest, which again raises questions about his judgment. Um, but again, again, you could say, all right, I don't believe that he assaulted her. I think that this was a consensual encounter. Again, they had unprotected sex, so he could have easily knocked up a married woman. And then he basically, she obviously had regrets about what happened, and then she made up the story that he had assaulted her and whatever, even though no, the witnesses at the time saw that they were very friendly and had their hands all over each other at the bar. Anyway, the point is that the case for Hegseth just isn't very compelling. Now, I think Trump's other nominees, I think, should go through. I like Bobby Jr. I like, and again, I mean, you could say that there are all sorts of things in Bobby Jr.'s past, and the New York Times, in a lip-smacking way, kind of listed them all on Sunday. All, again, lots of women, drugs, and so on. But on this issue, he does have credentials. I mean, this is something he has devoted his life to. He knows a great deal about issues of health, issues of food processing, and the rest. This is something he knows a lot about, and I think he deserves to get this position, irrespective of whatever bad judgments he had made in the past. But I don't. That doesn't apply in the case of Hegseth. That he just, Hegseth has a lot of, kind of somewhat disreputable life. I think enjoying the celebrity, and a lot of it comes about, because of his celebrity. Same with Bobby Jr. But because of celebrity, he got to help himself to a lot of available women. And then he decided to pay this woman off because he knew that and this was at the height of the Me Too hysteria, that if Fox News got a whiff of that of a story that he had somehow assaulted a woman, he would have been gone. He'd have lost that perch, and his entire career, his entire reputation is based on having that slot on Fox News, whatever it's called, Fox and Friends, or I don't know, whatever that show is called. So yeah, I think Bobby Jr. deserves to get the position. I think he should be confirmed. I think Tulsi Gabbard should be confirmed. I think she obviously deserves that position. And Kash Patel, I think, obviously deserves that position. I don't see it in the case of Hegseth. I mean, I think there's just too many problems. I can't believe that there isn't somebody better. I mean, his one thing that has going for him, at least as far as, I mean, leave aside for Trump, the celebrity, Fox News and so on, these good looks. The one thing is that he doesn't like woke in the military. No more woke in the military. Well, I'm quite sure you can find lots and lots of people who will also say, yeah, I don't want any woke in my military. No more woke. And I don't want transgender servicemen serving alongside women. Okay, so I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult to find, in fact, to find people who subscribe to those views, but who don't carry all the baggage that Pete Hegseth carries. So I'd have to say, generally, I think Trump should get his nominees through. I mean, he selected them. He won the election. he should have the team that he wants. And it's really quite disgusting that Republicans who are willing to vote for um, Biden's picks, all the various Susan Collinses and Mitch McConnell's and Lisa Murkowski, they were ready to vote for Biden's picks. Thoroughly, thoroughly ridiculous bunch of people. The guy who's a surgeon general. He's a surgeon general. You say, well, this surgeon general is a mentally sick person. I mean, he doesn't know whether he's a man or a woman. I mean, you'd say, well, okay, you're not sure you're a man or woman. You probably shouldn't be holding a position of trust with on matters of health, physical and mental health. I mean, obviously you have serious issues, serious mental health issues if you're not sure whether you're a man or a woman. So I don't think you should be in that position. But hey, Murkowski and Collins and the rest of them, they voted for this for this person as a Surgeon General. So they were ready to do that. Not to mention all the others, Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco and the rest of them. They voted for that, but no, they're not going to vote for Trump's picks. But in this case, I mean, if it's a close matter, then I don't see the case for Hegseth. The irony is that probably Hegseth will make it because he has all the right views on Israel, so Hegseth will make it, but Tulsi and Bobby Jr. and Kash Patel may have difficulties making it. But I think those three are good picks. I fail to see the case for Hegseth. And it's just I think it's I really just think Trump has this weakness for tall, good-looking, athletic guys. It's something he always brings up. The rallies he comes, oh boy, he's such a great-looking guy. Look at the muscles on him, and so on. So, and he likes people on television. So that's I just see, S.C. Dillon says Garland is a creature of the Obama era. Yeah, he was a creature of the Obama era, and of course he wanted him. And he no, that's he that he was going to be the replacement for Scalia was never going to happen, but he got a gig as Attorney General. Anyway, let's take a look at the our locals page. All the people who support us, day and night, as particularly they support the dogs. Because they know that it's all really about the dogs. And so here, so Danaki and says, says therefore. Oh, I missed something. Let's see. Yeah, I missed something. Here we are. The Danaki. So it says, as the Kremlin starts spinning to the complacent majority what a great victory the current situation is, can we pretty much presume a Korean, Syrian style ceasefire? We can also predict that Ukraine, backed by NATO guarantees and weapons, will use the time to prepare for a blitz offensive in a few years. Well, I have to say that that's my very I'm very anxious that something like that will happen, because again, it's really about what if you look at the experience of the past, that Russia left things unfinished. That Russia, which had Ukraine on the run, Ukraine on the ropes in 2014. Ukraine was not prepared for anything when the Russia intervened to protect the people of the Donbass. So they had Ukraine on the ropes. They had the justification to go in and topple the coup leaders in Kiev. There was nothing that could have stopped them at that stage, and they would have had the perfect justification for doing so, because move on to another page, because it was a coup, and therefore they had overthrown the legal, legitimate government in Kiev, and that after because yeah, that after they'd all the pledges that had been made in on February the 21st, that, oh well, we're going to wait for having the uh, uh, elections in December. This was an agreement between the opposition and Yanukovych. That didn't happen. The armed mob overthrew Yanukovych in violation of the pledges that had been made in that agreement, supposedly guaranteed by France, Germany, and Poland. And the United States, under Obama, had also pledged to support that agreement, and that lasted about 2 hours. So at that moment, Russia could have just marched into Kiev and had used as justification the fact that the legal, legitimate government of Ukraine had been overthrown. They were coming in, they were going to restore the president, Yanukovych, and then to essentially make sure that the agreement that had been signed on February the 21st, that agreement would be adhered to, and that Yanukovych, he'd be there, he'd stay on as president until December, when the elections would be held. So Russia would have had at that time the perfect justification for doing so. They didn't do it, and instead they kind of dawdled, and you know, uh, they they allowed the coup leaders in Kiev to consolidate, hold kind of fake elections, which brought Poroshenko to power, and then of course we had uh, the inconclusive war in the Donbass, and that culminated in the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. But that was just kicking the can down the road. I mean, anybody could have seen that Minsk I and Minsk II were no solution whatever to the problem. And Putin repeatedly said, "Oh, you're not adhering to the agreement. You're not fulfilling the agreement." Well, of course they weren't fulfilling the agreement. They were never going to fulfill the agreement. They were waiting for the moment to strike and to retake the Donbass. So that's really the issue here, which is that what will this peace plan, the Trump peace plan, be like? I would imagine it will entail freezing the conflict at the lines of contact. So in the meantime, Russia's now rushing, trying to seize some additional territory before Trump comes up with a plan. Now, I don't think Putin will reject the Trump plan. I think Putin will think that that it's would be a bad idea for Russia to to cross Trump. This is an opportunity to have better relations with the United States, and then maybe even some talk of a partial lifting of sanctions down the road. Um, Now, the one aspect of it, which I think might work in Russia's favor, is that even if Russia agrees to some form of a of the Trump peace plan, because imagine what happened in Istanbul, and we know that in Istanbul, Russia again kicked the can down the road, because all they wanted, all that Istanbul agreement, in committed Ukraine to, was no membership of NATO, neutrality, and certain restrictions on, certainly on foreign forces on Ukrainian soil, and restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian military. So that's all. But the issue of the Donbass, that was not settled at Istanbul. Even Crimea wasn't settled at Istanbul. All of that was just kicked down the road. Well, we're going to deal with the Donbass at some point. Some negotiations between Putin and Zelensky down the road. And so, so even, as I say, even the issue of Crimea, which we had been led to believe before February the 24th, 2022, was simply, oh, that's a done deal, that's over, that's just, that's not even up for discussion. Well, it turned out that it was up for discussion, and that there were all kinds of projects whereby Ukraine would lease Crimea, or Russia would pay Ukraine for Crimea. So, but that was all going to be dealt with at a later stage. So, in other words, even if Istanbul, which had been signed, had been initialed or whatever before Boris Johnson stepped in, it wasn't a good deal for Russia. Again, it was kicking the can down the road. It was just, in other words, it was still going to be a problem because, of course, as part of Istanbul would be all kinds of pledges and commitments to Ukraine. The Western powers would make all sorts of pledges and commitments to Ukraine, so that if Ukraine, and of course Ukraine would, start up the war 5-10 years down the road in the Donbass, it would be able to call on the Western guarantors to help it. So it was no kind of a solution, but Russia was willing to accept a very bad deal there, in April in Istanbul. It was Russia's very good fortune that Boris Johnson stepped in and said, "Nah, why don't we just go for the whole pie? Well, we can win this one. Russia's weak. Russia's not performing well militarily. We can beat Russia. So let's not even sign anything." It was only because the West got so greedy that essentially Russia was off the hook. Because if the West had agreed to that, I think we'd have had a really bad deal, and then in Ukraine. Now, in the case of Trump, I think, as I said, the deal will be freeze the conflict on the lines of contact, issue of NATO membership. We'll kind of discuss that at some later date. We're not going to talk about it for the time being. And maybe offer some kind of a recognition of the rights of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, though I doubt that they're going to go down that path. But essentially, what they will get from Kiev is a commitment, well, that you're not going to try and get the Donbass back for the time being, or Crimea back, by the use of force. that was what Trump would offer. Now the question is, I think Russia might say, okay, that's a plan that we can discuss. And again, I mean, the people say, "Oh, of course, Russia will never accept anything like this." Well, the record is Russia has always accepted all kinds of plans that were actually very detrimental to Russia's interests. So I think that Russia, I think, will want to work with Trump. I think they still have some hope that they can work with Trump. But I think Ukraine will not accept it. I think Zelensky is the one who is going to say, "We're not going to accept this," because as he has put it, that well, we might accept freezing the conflict in place, and we might commit ourselves to getting our territory back by diplomatic means. However, in exchange, we want NATO membership. But if they don't offer Zelensky NATO membership, then I think Ukraine will say no. The question then is, well, if Ukraine says no, and Russia says yes, maybe, what will Trump do? And as I said, I think you said it last week or the week before. I said, in that case, the Americans will blame Russia. They'll say it's all Russia's fault, even though it'll be Ukraine who had actually balked. They'll say, no, it's really Russia that's at fault, and then they'll try to take measures against Russia. That would whatever with whatever means, whether it's more ATACMS or harsher sanctions, or so they're going to penalize Russia, and I said the analogy was what happened in the case of Yugoslavia in 98, 99, when they were seeking to bomb Yugoslavia, but the only way they could get it is if the Americans put forward a peace plan that the Serbs would reject, but the Kosovo Albanians would accept. But as it turned out, it was the other way around. The Serbs said, "Yeah, maybe," and the Kosovo Albanians who said no. But even so, after after a lot of maneuvering, they finally got the go ahead to bomb the Serbs. So that's why I think something like that they're going to pull against Russia. I just don't. I do not think. I do not for 1 minute think that the Trump administration, given all the people in the Trump administration and the media, the foreign policy elite, are going to sit down and say, yeah, you know what? I think this is a really good deal, and Ukraine has really failed us in rejecting this fantastic deal. You know what we're going to do? We're going to cut Ukraine off. It just cannot happen. That's why all these comments from all these bloggers and so on, the alt media and so on, who say, oh, any minute now, Ukraine is going to be thrown under the bus. Oh, any minute now, the Americans are getting sick of Zelensky. It isn't going to happen. There is no way. There's no way in the world that they're going to conclude that Russia is the reasonable party. Ukraine is being unreasonable. Therefore, we will cut off the military assistance to Ukraine. It cannot happen. It cannot and will not happen. So that's why I think there will be a peace plan. I think the Russians may say, yeah, we're interested. Ukraine will say, no, we're not interested. And then I think the Americans will take out their wrath on Russia. Now, where that leads and how that develops, that's a different issue. So again, I think Russia might just be off the hook because of the unreasonableness of the West. Just like Russia was off the hook. At the time of the December, at the time of the February 2014 agreement, a very bad agreement. That was a really bad agreement for Zelensky. I mean, not Zelensky, Yanukovych. It was Yanukovych at the time, yeah. But But again, Russians were willing to accept, and again, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, not good deals for Russia, but Russia accepted them, and then of course Istanbul again, Russia accepted that. So no, that's the pattern here, and it's just, but the West just always gets a little greedy. They always just they want to really wipe the floor with Russia, and I think by getting greedy, they don't get the West fails to get what it wants. If it was just a step down a little bit on its demands, it would get what it wanted. Anyway, Donaki goes on. Therefore, when the Russians will have been once again caught with their pants down by the 72-hour Blitz Mariupol offensive and start whining about being led by the nose, how much will it be down to sheer stupidity, utter incompetence, corruption, and hidden open complicity? Well, that's again a very good point. What has really happened in Syria was really quite shocking in the sort of the complete collapse of what Russia had accomplished during those years. I mean, remember, Putin's reputation as this very formidable figure is derived from Syria. I mean, what he did in Syria when he stepped in and when it looked like Bashar al-Assad was for the birds, he was going to be overthrown. And he did it in a very dramatic way. He spoke at the UN General Assembly, and then within days, Russian jets were conducting airstrikes in Syria, and that his reputation is based on that. But he saved Syria, and I think he really has carried that over. I mean, it was already now some years ago, but he carried that over, and I think that's why when he launched the so-called special military operation, he still enjoyed that huge reputation that he had built up in Syria. But this is really gone. And then we watched, as very, the Mariupol offensive. I mean, you talk about the you remember the offensive September 2022. I mean, that was quite something. Again, we were all assuming that that somehow Russia had now taken this territory, and again we had McGregor and the rest, saying, well, this, Russia's really doing very well, and then Russia lost an awful lot of territory during the Ukrainian offensives. Much of the territory Russia still hasn't got back. So again, there was, we were led to believe certain things about the Russians, again, simply because of this huge reputation that Russia had built up. And now think about this, again with the Mariupol, because remember, we had those Azov battalion types who were supposedly going to be destroyed at Mariupol, because that was their base. And the strange thing, because again, that would, and if you're going for denazification and demilitarization, you want to destroy your Azov battalion types. But for some reason, Russia did some kind of a deal with Erdogan. Erdogan would take on board these Azov battalion types, and then he took them to Turkey, flown there, thanks to Abramovich. They were flown to Turkey, and then Putin's good friend Erdogan just sent them back into Ukraine, which kind of undermines the purpose of the special military operation. I mean, the Azov, these are the people you really want to eliminate, but for some reason they're back in Ukraine. They're back fighting for Ukraine. one of the many peculiarities of this war. Um, anyway, thank you, Danaki, for that. And then Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. So again, we had the screening yesterday of Bertolucci's film *The Last Emperor*, and it's a very long film. So if you're planning on watching it, you can either watch the whole thing in one go, if you're very brave, but if you want to savor it, maybe split it up into two film viewing sessions. But anyway, what's most important is that as you watch the movie, you read all of Cynthia's fascinating comments and observations, descriptions. She provides, an amazing trove of background information, all sorts of things that I didn't know. So it's really important as you watch or before you watch is that you read all of Cynthia's contributions. So thank you very much, Cynthia. Anyway, Cynthia says, last night you asked why the Chinese Communist Party didn't execute Puyi, who was the China's last emperor. And then says, it's because they wanted to use him as a symbol of the downfall of the old imperial system and to demonstrate their policy of rehabilitation by allowing him to reintegrate into society as a common citizen after a period of re-education and monitoring, rather than executing him as a political enemy. This approach was seen as a way to solidify their legitimacy and win over the population. Well, it's very odd because it's a very humanitarian policy. And one can't really say that Mao's communists were particularly humanitarian. And I mean, they were very brutal. He carried out extensive executions. Now, I guess the issue of rehabilitation did come up, even though you don't really get a sense of it in the film, because he did write his memoirs, and this film is really based on his memoirs, and presumably the Chinese communists wrote his memoirs for him, and I think he did all of that. He pleaded his guilt. He confessed to all his sins in the memoirs, and maybe that had an effect on the Chinese public. I don't know. I mean, you get a sense even from the film that he's largely a forgotten figure. I mean, once he's released from prison, I think he's released in 1959, and then I think he dies he's 67. That was a pretty brutal time. That was the Cultural Revolution that Mao had launched. Even though the Cultural Revolution was mostly directed at the communists, so he was purging the party, claiming that the party was selling out socialism, that was trying to bring back capitalism, and so on. So it was a way of Mao reasserting himself. He had become a marginalized figure, largely because of his many failings, like the collectivization of agriculture, the Great Leap Forward. I mean, it was one fiasco after another. But Mao used the Cultural Revolution to bring himself to the fore. So I think your characterization is probably right, but it's very interesting. I mean, because he obviously collaborated. He collaborated with the Japanese. I mean, the Japanese invaded Manchuria. They set up this puppet state of Manchukuo, and they appointed Puyi as the emperor, and he ruled there for a number of years as the emperor of Manchukuo, and of course he was entirely run by the Japanese. I mean, everything that he did was just simply on the orders of the Japanese. So, I mean, when you think of the all the other cases in which collaborators, because this is as explicit a collaboration as you can imagine, all the other collaborators um, were, in Europe, collaborators were executed. Those that they got their hands on, um, they, they executed. But of course, there were others who were allowed to escape. I mean, Ante Pavelic, the Croatian leader of the of the sort of the Ustaše fascist puppet state, he was allowed to escape. Now, he wouldn't have been allowed to stay on in Yugoslavia, but he escaped, and then he was shot. Then I think he then died in Spain. Um, Horthy, who wasn't strictly speaking a collaborator. I mean, he didn't really run a Nazi state on behalf of Hitler. Horthy was allowed to live out his life in Lisbon. So the last few years of his life he lived in Portugal, um, and but the Hungarian authorities, occasionally wanted him returned so he could face trial, but it didn't happen to. But others were executed. I mean, the Tiso in Slovakia was executed, and Szálasi, the Hungarian fascist leader, was executed. Uh, and of course, Pierre Laval in France was executed. Uh, so, so, so I mean, yeah, all right. Some people were allowed to escape, but they weren't allowed to go on living in in their own in their own countries in the way that Pui and again, I mean, Pui really was. I mean, he was for years and years. I mean, he was just simply the puppet of the Japanese. So he was quite lucky that he only spent a few years in prison. He was allowed to leave and then live a peaceful life in communist China as a gardener. And then, of course, he wrote his memoirs. Uh, his self-abnegation memoirs. So, um, it's quite a humane gesture. Again, it could easily you could easily see that they would have executed him, and of course, again, if one thinks about the Soviet communists, um, they executed the various collaborators. Vlasov, who had collaborated with the Nazis, he was executed. So and his collaboration was much less extensive than Pui's. So I think by and large, you say Pui got a pretty good deal in that he managed. He only spent a few years in prison, and then managed to spend live out the rest of his life peacefully in the People's Republic. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. That's a really interesting um, observation. Steve Brown, thank you very much for your generosity. Free Palestine. Yeah, that would be that would be nice. Um, there was an interesting debate. Amy with Norman Finkelstein and this woman. I forgot her name. She often appears uh, on the guy who does this talk TV for Rupert Murdoch. God. Anyway, all right. This it's God. Piers Morgan. Yeah, Piers Morgan. Yeah. So and it was kind of an interesting argument because they were actually in the studio together. There was, like one on one. Usually it's just simply these faces. They're all, like that. Um, and what I think is interesting, Finkelstein has a very pessimistic view, particularly when it comes to Gaza. I mean, he says basically Gaza is no more. There is no that there just isn't going to be any Gaza, and that they basically whoever is still living in Gaza will be driven out. They'll be, one way or another, they're going to be um, uh, driven out. And and I think that that's probably where this goes. I mean, it's like that. It's just go on making life so intolerable that there's just people will leave, and then yeah, I mean, what people will do eventually leave. I mean, people will go anywhere. They might go to Turkey, they might go to Syria. Of course, they all want to go to Europe, but I do think that when you look at it, then it's very hard to see how how Gaza can go on functioning. I mean, it's just there's just nothing left. I mean, it's just rubble, and it's, deliberately so. So you can't really go back to Oslo, because Oslo was supposed to be, West Bank and Gaza was supposed to comprise the Palestinian state. I think that's gone. Anyway, Marty says, hello, good evening, and welcome. Tuesday. Now, hello, good evening, and welcome is, of course, very reminiscent of David Frost. That was his signature introduction. And Marty very generously posted the interviews that David Frost conducted with Richard Nixon in 1977. So it's basically it was four parts, four distinct sections. So there's one on Watergate, one on his his foreign policy, another one about the war at home and abroad, and then some that they said it's about his personal life, but it wasn't really about his personal life, but it was about the various issues that he had to deal with, like the case of Spiro Agnew, the vice president, and so on. So I do, there's a lot to see, but I do recommend watching that, because Nixon was really a rather unique politician. Is that he was very candid, and he was always thinking. He never gave predictable, rehearsed responses. So Frost, he would ask good questions, and Nixon would give always very thoughtful answers. And I think it's just amazing, just after all these years, when you listen to a politician, thinking about a question and think about the best way to answer that. So obviously, there's a lot there about Vietnam and why he didn't end it in '69 and so on. But it was just really really interesting, really worth listening to. What I think, in a way, is, and that's where he incidentally he makes that famous comment, which which just says, if the president does it, it's not illegal, which of course caused a lot of outrage at the time. But of course Nixon was absolutely right, and of course the Supreme Court, when it made its recent immunity ruling, agreed with what Nixon said. If the president does it, it's in his official capacity, it's not illegal. And so Nixon was right, but there are other things which have, when you look back on Watergate, in a way, why is Watergate such an inconsequential event? Well, because the media and the politicians really wanted to use it to get Nixon, and they used Watergate in order to focus on the cover-up. Everything was about the cover-up. Well, now when you look back on it, and there's a whole 1 hour discussion of Watergate, and Frost is asking him about that in very, very detailed questions. It's all about the cover-up. Well, when we look back on it now, which is now, wow, 47 years ago. Wow, 47 years ago, that interview. Um, you look and say, well, who the hell cares? Who are all these people, that who have all now been largely forgotten? Magruder, Colson, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, he did this and they had this meeting, but because it was all about the cover up, which is really in itself very, very boring. Now, there may be issues about legal liability and so on. So are you caught up in something like obstruction of justice? But fundamentally, it's of no real importance. Now, why they broke into the Watergate? What were they looking for? Who exactly were these people? Who gave the order to break in? Those are interesting questions. But that was the fascinating aspect of Watergate, that no one really ever explored those questions. The only question was the cover up, and then of course Nixon's own role in the cover up, and that's why you watch this and how Frost is really going into all the weeds about who said what in what meeting, and whether some criminal culpability arises from that. It's just boring and is of no real importance. And but again, it just shows how uh, history is made, and we never really learn about anything that's important. So we never really learned any of the important issues about Watergate. Instead, we got bogged down with John Dean and Jeb Magruder and all the rest of these uh, very minor characters. One very nice thing is when he talks about Woodward and Bernstein, he said Woodward and Bernstein were trash. That was very nice. I like the idea of him referring to Woodward and Bernstein as trash. Anyway, Marty, thank you for your generosity, and thank you for posting that. That I think important historical record about Nixon's interview with. I don't know how you found it, because I've looked in the past trying to find those interviews, and I've never been able to find it. So kudos to you for having found it. Anyway, Danaki says, yet Trump's team said January 6ers will not receive a blanket pardon, just a case-by-case decision. Yeah, thanks, Donnie. Yeah, I mean, that's what he has been saying. Yeah, that it's going to be case-by-case. Well, I guess, if one wants to look at it most charitably, it's possible that there will be blanket pardons, with the exception of the people who've been convicted of violent offenses. And as I said, I think the violence is I think overdone. There were circumstances why violence happened, but maybe that's what they're saying. Well, yeah, I mean, if you were non-violent, you get a pardon. But again, we'll have to see. And Trump was very, as I said, he wasn't exactly very generous with his pardons, but this is quite a big one. I mean, because again, the MAGA feels very strongly about the January 6th, and if he dawdles, lets 6 months, a year go by without issuing a pardon, I think that there's going to be a lot of disenchantment with him. Anyway, thank you for that. Steve Brown says, it seems that businessmen don't always adequately read the Prince or Mike Ledeen, Machiavelli and Modern Leadership. No, businessmen don't read the Prince. I wouldn't recommend people to read Michael Ledeen in general. He was one of the worst of the Iraq War architects. I've always tried to avoid reading anything by Michael Ledeen. But yeah, there's no question. I think that Trump has never exactly figured out who he was up against, which is why I think he gets easily outmaneuvered. And I think that's going to happen now. I think that the Democrats are already they were shell shocked after the defeat, but they're already regrouping, and I think that they'll figure out a way to get back in and defeating him. I think the midterms, I think, is going to be good for the Democrats, and I think again, when it comes to this foreign policy, I think Trump will pursue a very standard establishment bipartisan foreign policy. And I think the people who are expecting some huge changes, they're going to be disappointed. I think when it comes, I think with some things, I think he's going to be more hawkish. I think when it comes to China, it'll be more hawkish. But again, as I said before, I don't have anything particular against tariffs. I think tariffs are a perfectly good form of policy. I think governments should protect the domestic industries. What I think is interesting is how that Trump doesn't seem to get what when he threatened BRICS with that 100% tariffs, he didn't seem to he didn't seem to quite get that these countries, the BRICS countries, they don't want to launch a new currency. They don't have a problem with the dollar. They're very happy to work with the dollar. The only reason they've complained about the dollar is the use of the dollar as a way of sanctioning other countries, a way of punishing America's adversaries. That's why they've been thinking about finding an alternative currency, an alternative reserve currency, but they're nowhere near that. They have no real means of doing it. It's just, they've talked about this, but they have no real mechanism to do it. But that's the only reason. It has nothing to do with trying to damage America or anything that's involving they're trying to take over the global financial system. They're not doing that. They just don't like when you use the dollar as a way of punishing countries. That's the only issue, and he kind of confuses two separate issues, which is the tariffs, which I think have their place if you want to protect your farmers, you want to protect your industries from the issue of the use of the dollar as a tool to punish other countries, and I think and I think these are just two completely different issues that Trump confuses. I think what the BRICS have been complaining about, I think is very is they're absolutely right to complain about that. This is terrible that they can just use the dollar just to seize other countries' dollar assets. That has nothing to do with trying to essentially undercut America's domestic industries. I mean that's a different thing altogether. And again, it's a very strange thing for Trump to go to talk up having this strong dollar, the high value of the dollar, and you're wanting to do something about your trade deficit. If you want a big trade deficit, that's when you have an overvalued currency. That's when you get a trade deficit. So Trump just throws these things around, and a number of them really are incompatible with one another. I think if you want to make your goods competitive, and if you want to keep out the manufactured goods of your economic rivals, you don't want to have a strong dollar. That's not the way to do it. Strong dollar works for Wall Street. The only people who want a strong dollar is Wall Street, because that means all the capital comes to America, and it's a boon for Wall Street. But it also leads to deindustrialization. That's what you've had in America. If you're in finance, you're doing very well. If you're manufacturing, then you're not doing so well. Carlos says, I really enjoyed yesterday's movie. Thanks for posting. Good. I'm glad. I had one too many beers last night and went back and watched Ninochka as well. That's a very good, that's a good movie. And that's, we can have always a pleasure. It's always a real delight. And then Cynthia goes on. Kevork Almasian, who I think will be on the Gaggle very soon. He's been on the Gaggle before, so he's always very good. So Kevork Almasian recently explained why he is very doubtful that the axis of resistance can prevent Israel from gaining full control over not just Gaza and Lebanon, but also Syria and possibly even Iran, which is largely because Israel has hacked into and compromised the entire internal communications, mainly via an Israeli spyware app called Pegasus. He also believes the Israelis probably have infiltrated the Iranian government, possibly through a US-backed silent coup. I have to say, I find that extremely plausible. It's clear that in the case of Hezbollah, it was totally, thoroughly infiltrated by Israel. That's why that whole walkie-talkie pager thing worked as smoothly as it did. Clearly, they absolutely penetrated the command and control, the whole business trading of Hezbollah. So they knew exactly how the pages would come into Lebanon, what all the different points in the distribution cycle. So they knew exactly when to insert their explosive devices. So I think that's the case. I think that it's very plausible about Iran also. I mean, the fact that they were able to conduct these assassinations in Iran, including Ania, right there in Tehran, would indicate that they absolutely thoroughly infiltrated Iran. Now, whether the Israelis did this or whether they did it in collaboration with the Americans or the Americans did it and the Americans simply passed on this information to the Israelis, I don't know. I'm always a little doubtful attributing these superpowers to Israel because everyone wants to think that, and Israel loves the idea that it's the superpower. I've always thought that it was almost certainly the Americans who were the ones who really penetrated these networks and then passed this information on to the Israelis. But if these, I think the American attitude was that, well, if Israel wants to take the credit, let Israel take the credit. But I do think that it's thoroughly penetrated, and there's no question that that they've devastated Gaza, that it's just destroyed. I mean, there's no way that Gaza can ever comprise any kind of a Palestinian entity. And again, as Finkelstein said, even if the war were to end tomorrow, the rebuilding that would be necessary is just staggering. How are you going to get all that rubble out of the country? Who's going to pay for removing all the rubble? And then how are you going to build anything? Because Israel wouldn't allow any concrete to come into Gaza. They're going to say, no, you can't bring any concrete in because you're going to use the concrete to build tunnels. So there's no way that you can even remove the rubble, and there's no way that you can bring concrete into Gaza. So it cannot happen. And clearly, I mean, Hezbollah has taken a terrible pounding at the hands of Israel. So again, we had assumed And there's a lot of big talk after the war of 2006. Oh, Hezbollah had inflicted this defeat on Israel. Well, it was all wildly exaggerated. It turned out that Hezbollah had been thoroughly penetrated by Israel, and Israel um, did what it needed to do, which is to end the two front war. That's all it wanted to do, to end the two front war. They can deal with Hamas without having to worry about Hezbollah. That they've accomplished. And even now, when we have this ceasefire, all the ceasefire violations are coming from Israel. It's Israel who just continues to pound Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. Apparently, that's still compatible with the ceasefire, and conducting assassinations of Hezbollah leaders in Syria, which is what they're doing. They're killing Hezbollah leaders in Syria. So I kind of agree with that, the pessimistic diagnosis. And I think I'm also pessimistic about the prospects of survival for Bashar al-Assad. I mean, I know the Russians and the Iranians have said they're going to do what they can to help him survive, but they just don't have the resources. Russia's completely preoccupied with Ukraine. I mean, they don't even have the resources to spare to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk. That was 4 months ago. That was 4 months ago when Ukraine invaded Kursk. They're still there. They were going to be pushed out within 48 hours. They're still there. So Russia doesn't have the forces to spare for that. I don't think they have the forces to spare to save Assad. And Hezbollah, I think, is weakened. Iran's very weak. So I think that I think he's got his work cut out to survive Bashar al-Assad. So yeah, so Cynthia, I do tend to agree with that pessimistic diagnosis. And then Cynthia, there's the podcast where Kevork explains all this. Yeah, no, that's I'm going to look that up. And as I say, Kevork will be joining us very soon on the Gaggle, so he'll be able to elaborate more when he's on our podcast. R. Brown says, I don't think the pardon precludes a full investigation of Hunter during the period covered by the pardon. I agree. He won't go to prison for such crimes, but the American people deserve to know the full story. Oh, I agree. And I think that's the upside of a pardon, which is that you can't plead the Fifth Amendment anymore. So therefore, you are obligated. If you have a congressional subpoena, you are obligated to answer all questions, and you're still liable for perjury. So you have to answer all questions truthfully, because any perjury that you commit while testifying to Congress, the Biden pardon will not apply to that. So he has to avoid perjury, and he has to testify before Congress. He can't plead the Fifth. And so yeah, I mean, I think that all of that should, I mean, the Republicans should find out more about what the hell went on in Ukraine. I mean, at the very least. So that, I think that's absolutely right. And so, in fact, the pardon makes it all the more likely that we're going to find out something about what the hell happened. Anyway, R. Brown goes on. In fact, I heard a lawyer on Bannon's show say that by accepting the pardon, Hunter waives his Fifth Amendment rights. Yeah, no, absolutely right. Doesn't that open the door to take down all the other Bidens and anyone else that colluded with them on criminal grounds, punishable the full extent of the law? Will Biden pardon the other members of his crime family in the next 40 plus days? Well, I tend to think that he will. I think that he's got a number of days there, and I would have thought the pardon will be a sequence of one pardon after another. I would have thought a number of his family members are quite vulnerable. I mean, his brother James, in particular, who's supposedly the brains of the operation. I don't know why he's thought of, but James is clearly vulnerable. I'm absolutely convinced that Biden will pardon them. The only question that we need to answer is, will he pardon himself? And I tend to think that he will. Or he will work out a deal with Trump, that Trump will pardon him. Probably among his first acts on January the 20th, he will, on that afternoon, he will pardon Biden. But yeah, I mean, there's no question. I think and then once they all have pardons, then yeah, they will have to go testify. There's no way that they can avoid it. And we might find out something, but it's, if you waive your Fifth Amendment rights, you have to come clean. You can't, you have to tell everything that and you have to really be very, very careful about committing perjury. I guess we'll get that something, but I'm always skeptical about the Republicans. I just that they're not going to get very far. I just feel they will, no question, they're going to invite Hunter in to testify, and I just feel that the questioning just won't go anywhere. I'm always just pessimistic with these Republicans, and we'll get lost in the weeds, and we won't get very far. Same with Fauci. I mean, we'll never get anywhere with Fauci and all the rest, and I'd like to think that we will get somewhere, but but I don't know. But yeah, but I think it will still be interesting. And then Marty presents these pictures, the pictures that he was from the School of Infantile Art. Your colors are the wrong shape. This is the artwork that he was selling for $500,000. Imagine. Oh, nothing corrupt about this. A man with no artistic talent, no artistic training, and he was selling his paintings for $500,000. That I have to say that's a good deal. And then Steve Brown says, Bush pardoned all Contra criminals: McFarlane, Poindexter, Weinberger, Elliot Abrams, Dwayne Claridge, who's the worst of the worst neocons. Yeah, Bush did that right at the very end of his term of office so that would be 1993. It's interesting that he did do that, because he had kind of distanced himself from Iran Contra. He said, well, it had nothing to do with me. I think that was when he famously said, I was out of the loop. And there was another phrase that he used, there was no quid pro quo. There was no quid pro quo when he would defend himself. But he was came under some suspicion. But Lawrence Walsh, I think, just this goes back a way, but sometime I think just before the election, he handed down indictments, and Bush felt that these indictments that Walsh handed down had hurt him, and so he kind of blamed his loss to Clinton on Walsh handing down these indictments. I don't really look. Walsh, he was a sort of the Jack Wright. Is it Jack Wright? Whatever. No, not Jack Wright. Jack. What? Yeah. What's the God? Now the name escapes. The prosecutor going after Trump. is it Jack Walsh? God, such a. Um, and so anyway, the Lawrence Walsh was the kind of nutty special prosecutor of his day, um, and but the thing was that he was really got quite vindictive, and without question he wanted to hurt George H.W. Bush, but Bush was going to lose anyway. He was always going to lose the 1992 election. There was really never any point in that election when there was any chance that Bush was going to win. I mean, even when even at that moment, remember Ross Perot was in the election and Ross Perot was leading the polls. Bush was never. There was never any moment when Bush was leading in the polls. And then when Perot got out of the race, Clinton took a 5-point lead, and he never lost that. Clinton consistently led Bush by some 5 points. And then even when Perot got back into the race at the end of the summer, it didn't make any difference. Clinton consistently led Bush in the polls. So Bush, I think, felt aggrieved that Lawrence Walsh handed down these indictments in order to hurt him, and but he would have lost the election anyway. It was just the public didn't really like him very much. He was just too much of the sort of the kind of unattractive wasp. Mitt Romney had that quality as well. Just the public just didn't like Mitt Romney, and so they didn't really like Bush. He won in 1988 because he was still essentially in the shadow of Ronald Reagan. Anyway, I think the name is Jack Smith. Jack Smith is the one who's been going after Trump. So it was Jack Smith, and then but somehow they all have these one-syllable names. So it's like Lawrence Walsh, or the kind of that kind of So, but Lawrence Walsh was the sort of the Jack Smith of his day, and then Bush, right at the very end of his term in office, and handed out these pardons. I think largely just to screw Walsh over, as revenge for what Walsh had done to him. But and of course, it enabled Elliot Abrams to make a political comeback. I mean, he somehow got all these positions. He was head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and then he even wormed his way back into Donald Trump's favors after saying all those mean things about Trump in 2016. Somehow he got to be the point man on Venezuela under Trump. But yeah, God, that goes back a way. Weinberger was never convicted of anything, but Weinberger was indicted, and I think that was the thing that hurt Bush, because I think it was the Weinberger indictment that came down a few days before the election. So anyway, Steve Brown said, Cynthia, yes, Kevork seems to be the most realist of commentators and is a great gent, but depressing to listen to his commentary, at least at this point. Israel and the neocons are like a whack-a-mole. The destabilization of the Middle East is legion and has been going on for longer than my own lifetime. Yeah, that's yes, that's been going on. It's really interesting that that all the lies, that like that debate on Finkelstein, and somebody actually mentioned her name, this woman's name. I just saw it a moment ago that somebody had, this Fleur, what was it? Fleur Hassan. That's it. Fleur Hassan. Marty, of course, always knows these things. Fleur Hassan. And she was saying about how the Arabs have always attacked Israel. And so they put out this lie about how the Arabs attacked Israel in 1967. And of course, Finkelstein, tried to correct her. But what's really so striking is when you talk about 67, which is now 57 years ago. And so anyone who has a living memory of that will already be middle-aged or elderly. But and within whatever days or weeks of the 6-Day War, they adopt this UN resolution 242, demanding that Israel withdraw from its occupied territories. Israel has not done it. And not only has Israel not done that, Israel has, in contravention of the Geneva Conventions, has been building settlements on those occupied areas. And it's just going to go on. I mean, to believe that somehow one day anything is going to change, I mean, you have to be kind of really naive to do that. And the people, unlike Kevork, who talk this nonsense about Israel's going to lose, Israel, well, the people who say Hezbollah kicked Israel's ass, Iran can destroy Israel. I mean, it's just fantasy. It cannot happen. Because, even if the worst comes to the worst, and again, we know that we were talking earlier about how Israel has infiltrated and undermined a number of these states. But even if it didn't happen, Israel has nuclear weapons, and Israel is willing to use the nuclear weapons. That's the Samson option. It's always going to do that. So it's just that's why it's why with Finkelstein you always have a very realist view, and I think Kevork, I think also contributes to a very realist view. And I think one has to have that, just rather than just live on these fantasies, these blogs who tell us this, spin all these wonderful stories about, Russian victories and Israeli victories and so on. You got to just, I think you have, just because you want something to be true doesn't mean it is true. Anyway, Judy, always good to see you, Judy. Thank you so much for your generosity. So Judy says, Trump just talked about January 6th as yesterday. This was the response to pardon of Hunter. Does the pardon given by Joe to Hunter include the January 6th hostages who have now been in prison for years? Such an abuse and miscarriage of justice. Okay, so let me read that again. This was his response to the pardon of Hunter. Does the pardon given by Joe to Hunter include the January 6th hostages who have now been in prison for years? Such an abuse and miscarriage of justice. Look, I mean, he has said a lot of very good things and very reasonable things about the January 6th, really over the years. There's no question he's done that. The question that still is, will he follow through and pardon? I think he will pardon them. I mean, I do think he will pardon them. The question is, when is he going to pardon them? Because if you're sitting in prison, it matters whether you're going to be pardoned on January the 20th of 2025, or you're going to be pardoned on January the 20th, 2029. And I think that's the question. I don't doubt that he will pardon them, but I think the real question is he going to move on this? Because he didn't move on a lot of people that he should have moved on. I think we talked about it earlier. The Flynn, Manafort, Roger Stone. These are real loyalists. These are Trump loyalists. Bannon. And even in the case of Bannon, remember he pardoned Bannon, but he didn't pardon Bannon's two colleagues or who were involved in that whole thing about building the wall. I mean, I don't know whether he was it was up on it was on the level or it wasn't. But nonetheless, I mean, since the feds had built this criminal conspiracy against Bannon and two other people, it wasn't really very nice for him to pardon Bannon, but to leave the other two still facing the feds. So that's I think the issue. And then with others, I mean, he delayed and delayed pardoning Snowden and Assange until I think his hands were really tied. I think he probably was going to pardon Snowden and Assange, but then the impeachment came up, and then he was fighting for his life. I mean, he was really he needed the Senate to acquit him, and there was no question that all of us, all the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnells who voted to acquit him, would have voted to convict. If he had pardoned Snowden and Assange, they would have voted to convict. So at that moment, he was fighting for his life, and so he didn't pardon Assange. I mean, interesting now whether he will pardon Assange. I mean, I think probably he will, but I think that's going to be, down the road. I mean, I guess the urgency of that is now, isn't so great because he's been released. But however, I'm sure Snowden would probably like to see America again. So I mean, we'll see. But I just have a feeling that this isn't going to be a high priority for him. Anne-Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Glad you were able to join us yesterday to watch The Last Emperor. So thank you. Was it? So Marty's he's posted something. I gotta take a look at what this is. Picture. Jimmy Carter, American historian and social critic Noam Chomsky Carter said Carter was the least violent of American presidents, but he did things which I think would certainly fall under Nuremberg provisions in Nazi Germany. It's very funny that people say this about Jimmy Carter because, of course, Jimmy Carter launched the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter launched the Contras, the training and arming of the Contras. It started in Argentina and that force, and so he and of course the big buildup, the huge military buildup that Ronald Reagan always gets the credit for, but that was actually started by Jimmy Carter. Now, on a personal level, I think Carter does come across as a rather nice, gentle person. But nonetheless, I mean, those activities, which kind of dominated the 80s, which was the Mujahideen, and then the Contras, that was actually launched by Jimmy Carter, even though, again, Reagan always took the credit for it. So anyway, Steve Brown says, January 6th was a massive setup, including by the FBI. Greg Kelly and others have done a lot of exposure on this. I agree. I agree with that. Funny thing is, January the 6th really did scare the crap out of Pelosi and company. Anyway, bottom line for me, January the 6th somewhat illustrate Trump's lack of political acumen. No, I think so. But to be fair to Trump, he did try to get in some National Guard presence there. I mean, there's no question. The record is unambiguous, even though the Democrats and media lied about it. But he did want a National Guard presence, so he may well have had an inkling that something untoward would go down on that day. But yeah, and there's no question. I mean, he was set up there, and that that was touch and go. that could have gone very badly for him. I mean, it wasn't touch and go in the sense that it was an insurrection or the government was on the brink of overthrow, but it was touch and go for him personally, because even when it was happening, I thought it was going to be quite likely that he would be prosecuted for this. That he would be prosecuted for having instigated this. I mean, I don't know whether I didn't know then whether the prosecution would be successful. I didn't think he would be impeached because I've never heard of a president being impeached when he's no longer president. Um, but I did think that the Biden Justice Department would go after him for that. So yeah, and I mean I agree that that he lacked a political acumen, not to realize that he was being set up. Now he lacked political acumen during Russiagate. Should have seen right away that this whole thing was being used against him primarily to impeach him, but also to undermine his foreign policy. Oh, Marty has given us a beautiful painting, of of Angela Merkel, in this kind of Vermeer kind of style, painting of Angela Merkel, so by Vermeer. Steve Brown says, for those who believe that Trump will MAGA and save the world, I will personally guarantee you that it is entirely incorrect. One thing I hope from him is that he might reduce U.S. taxes. Well, he might do that. I think that's actually one of the things that he probably will do. It's the signature policy of almost all Republicans that they reduce taxes. The one Republican who didn't do that was, of course, the elder Bush, George H.W. Bush, and he paid the price of losing the election. But I think everybody else, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, you reduce that, and of course Trump himself in his first term, you reduce taxes. So I do think that that's something that he will do. I think he will reduce taxes. And then he gets, see, I like all these paintings. And then anyway, Judy Hotchkiss says, Hexeth was chosen to be the bull in the china shop inside the Defense Department. He will have massive support from the ordinary soldiers to throw out the woke and insurrectionist top brass, while at the same time Musk and Vivek slash the defense budget. That's why he has the support of MAGA. Whether he has the courage to follow through or not is the question. Well, that's where I have to say, I do think that if Musk and Vivek, and they probably will try to slash the defense budget, I don't think Hexeth will go along with it. I think Hexeth will absolutely do what every defense secretary does, which is to fight tooth and nail for every single penny that's appropriated for the Pentagon and more. He will demand even more for the Pentagon. I may be wrong, but I think that's what he will do. He will demand more, and Congress, which always appropriates more for the Pentagon than the Pentagon actually asked, because they feel that's their obligation, and the Pentagon asks for $850 billion, then Congress will appropriate $900 billion. So I have to say I have my doubts that Musk and Vivek will rein in the Pentagon. I mean, other people have tried it. I mean, it's not he wouldn't be the first. Musk wouldn't be the first person who tried to pare down the Pentagon. But no one has ever succeeded. I mean, Robert McNamara, that was his big calling card. I mean, that's why he was appointed to that position by Kennedy. You got to do something with this Pentagon. I mean, it's just this gigantic boondoggle. And McNamara, who was supposedly this ruthless corporate type, he got his hands around Ford Motor Company, and he somehow made it more leaner and meaner and whatever. He didn't, but nonetheless, that was the perception of McNamara, and they thought that he was going to do this to the Pentagon. He failed as well. So it's been tried, but no one has succeeded in slashing the Pentagon. It was, and then James Schlesinger was another one who was going to do that. He was another tough guy. You got to bring him in, and he's going to get his hands around it. It's not been done. But anyway, thank you so much, Judy. Yeah, Fleur Hassan, that terrible person. I think she was a deputy mayor. I can't remember, deputy mayor of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. I don't remember. And then Marty says, very amusingly, this whole thing, but Finkelstein was supposed to debate Benny Morris at Oxford. And I think as Finkelstein told the story, Benny Morris said that he wouldn't debate Finkelstein unless he had Olmert would join him. But Olmert said, "Wait, I'm not going to debate Finkelstein." And then when Olmert pulled out, then Benny Morris pulled out, and then somebody else was brought in, who Finkelstein said is a psychopath. I'm not sure who he was referring to, but he said, "Oh, this is a psychopath," because there's so many kind of Israel apologists who are psychopaths. And then Finkelstein himself pulled out. So that debate never happened. But interestingly, I mean, Finkelstein and Benny Morris have appeared on Piers Morgan. I think at least once, or maybe even twice. And then Finkelstein and Benny Morris appeared, I think, on Crosstalk some years ago with Peter. But each time they do it, Benny Morris is always very condescending to Finkelstein. I mean, I think he regards himself as an important professor, and so he's always condescending, and often just very rude and very dismissive towards Finkelstein. He kind of rolls his eyes, he interrupts him, and so on. But in terms of the substance of the debate, I think Finkelstein gets the better of it. I mean, Benny Morris does the theater, the rolling of eyes, but in terms of substance, Finkelstein is better. And then Vic Shakapoulos, Shakapopoulos said, "Dear George, that's why were you not too keen on the parallax view in one of your live streams? It is one of my favorite films of that era. It mixes Hitchcockian plot with the 70s conspiracy paranoia quite well, in my opinion. Just a scene where the protagonist is psychologically tested by the organization is so intense and memorable that it alone made me appreciate the picture a lot. Do you know of any other films of that genre that you would recommend, or it's not your thing at all?" Well, the problem with the parallax view was that they couldn't come up with a plausible story. I mean, it didn't really make sense. I mean, I'm all for paranoia, I'm all for conspiracies, but you've got to come up with some. I mean, if you're going around murdering people, then tell us something about why you're murdering. What's the end game here? What are you trying to achieve? And I think that's why it failed. It was quite well done. I mean, I'll grant you, it was quite atmospheric. Those empty buildings. There's something quite really intimidating by just huge buildings that are just completely empty. But I didn't like. I thought Warren Beatty was miscast in the film. But as I say, I think my problem is that if you want to do the conspiracy and you want to do the paranoia, then at least you have to come up with a better story. Now, the one I would say that does that reasonably well, and we had the screening of that on the Gaggle, which is the conversation with Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall. I mean, that was also a paranoia and a conspiracy, but at least it was plausible. There was clearly a plausible conspiracy in place. I mean, there was even a certain ambiguity, which is also good. We don't know whether the conspiracy is real or whether it's just a paranoia on the part of the the private investigator. So we don't know, but that's good. I mean, the ambiguity is always good. But I think the conversation does that kind of paranoia well. But all that time, for instance, the 3 days of the Condor doesn't succeed. Again, the conspiracy isn't plausible, and the whole thing isn't plausible. I mean, the whole idea that you can just go into a townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, kill, I don't know, a dozen people, and then you just calmly walk away, and there's never any investigation. They don't. No one comes after you. Then I mean, we know. You kill a dozen people in an Upper East Side townhouse. I mean, the whole city would go crazy. I mean, the police would be, going through, throughout the whole city, from one end of New York to another, finding the killer. But here, apparently, you just kill someone, you walk away, and nothing really happens. You go and have lunch. So that's again my problem with some of these conspiracy movies is that there's never any real plausibility to them. So I mean, again, 3 Days of the Condor is quite a well-made film. I think probably a better film than The Parallax View, but just no plausibility. The executive action, which I also mentioned, I think that wasn't particularly well made. Sorry, just to answer the question, is there one that I would recommend? I'd recommend The Conversation, but maybe Gagglers can think of other conspiracy movies that I haven't thought of, which are pretty good. I mean, I guess I mean the James Bond movies are where I guess those early ones I kind of lost interest over, but that's a kind of a conspiracy, a strange organization that wants to take over the world. Neither with the Americans nor with the Soviets, but doing all sorts of controlling the planet, controlling the weather, and who knows what else. Anyway, Steve Brown says, interesting about Watergate, Helms lied on the stand where he said that CIA had no advanced knowledge of participation in the break-in of the DNC offices. Later on, when it was proved that the CIA did know in advance about the break-in, it was stated that it is okay for the CIA to commit perjury just because the CIA has an inherent right to lie in court, still presented today as okay in the interests of national security. I don't, in terms of the details of Watergate, I don't know that Helms had advanced knowledge of the break-in. I mean, Helms obviously knew E. Howard Hunt, but I don't know whether he had advanced knowledge of the break-in. Now, the CIA was kind of prevented by statute from engaging in this kind of domestic activity. Now we know that they violated the statute, but the statute that set up the CIA was quite explicit that they can only engage in covert activities abroad. They're not able to engage in covert activities at home. But of course, they violated that, and we found that out from during the Church Committee, particularly when they found out about they were reading Americans' mail. James Angleton, he was hauled before the Church Committee. That was the first time anyone had ever, he had this legendary reputation in the CIA, but nobody had ever seen him until he came and testified before the Church Committee. But he was reading Americans' mail. So the CIA had clearly violated the statute in engaging in covert activities inside the United States. I mean, yeah, you can do that abroad, but you can't do that at home. The thing about the with going back to Watergate. I mean, the Watergate burglars were tied up with the plumbers unit, that had been set up inside the Nixon White House in order to stanch the leaks. That's why it was called the plumbers. The no more leaks, and that was the function of that. Now, this is really where it gets kind of interesting, because they were doing this. I suppose they were tasked to do these black bag jobs, and this is where Nixon had become quite preoccupied around about 1970 or 71 about the leaks, about subversion inside America, and so he wanted essentially to set up a unit inside the White House, and it was called the Houston Plan, and after this guy, White House aide Tom Houston. Now, J. Edgar Hoover didn't really want to go along with this. And then, but nonetheless, Hoover didn't really want to go along with it, and Helms didn't really want to go along with it. But nonetheless, this plumbers unit, set itself up inside the White House, and that's when David Frost. This is where it was really interesting when David Frost asked him, "Well, how can you do this? Aren't you supposed to abide by the law? You can't. How can you just go and break into offices and so on?" And that's when Nixon said, if the president does it, it's not illegal. So, I think Nixon at that time did think that that there were such things as presidential powers that could not be limited by the law. And now that doesn't mean that Nixon signed off on the burglary of the Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist, this Dr. Fielding. That seems still a mystery. Who ordered that break-in? But it's a kind of a peculiarity of that time, that there was still a belief, whether it was all presidents up until Nixon, and that includes FDR, that includes Truman, that includes Kennedy and Johnson, believed that a president could order the break-in of anything. You could just as I say, break in with the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office. I mean, no one really believes that now. Now you should go through the courts, but FDR didn't think that you had to go through the courts, and Kennedy didn't think you had to go through the courts to do that. But Nixon, followed that lead of the president, saying, "No, well, if I'm the president, I can order this." And so that's why that went ahead. That Houston Plan, in a way, was it went ahead, and they created this plumbers unit, which then was seconded onto the committee to re-elect the president, and then led to the break-in at the Watergate. But I don't know to what extent Helms knew. Whether Helms may well have had an inkling. He must have known all about the plumbers unit. He had to have known about Helms's involvement in that. But whether he knew the details of the Watergate break-in, I'm not sure. And where am I? Yes. And then Denaki says, well, the chief of the anti-Mossad unit in Tehran was himself a Mossad agent. Yep, that's right. Himself a Mossad agent, exactly. But I think it's also plausible that Haniyeh was eliminated by a faction from Iran itself, or maybe joined up in coordination with Israel and or America. Well, that's all possible. But the the problem with, I think, Iran, and it's one has to address, is that it's probably not a great idea to have a state run by clerics. I mean, you really want to, you want to have your state run by, ruthless killers. The way that Israel is. Israel is run by ruthless killers. And the United States run by ruthless killers. Um, Clerics, they're kind of living in a different century, and I think I think the people who run Iran are just not up to the task of taking on Israel and the United States. So that's why I'm also a little pessimistic. I think you got to have you got to have. I mean, when you're up against Israel, you really need the most ruthless figures, and I'm just not sure that these people are up to the task. They had some of them. I mean, they had some of those people in the past who seemed better, like Ahmadinejad. But these people, these clerics, who right up to the present day, I think they're still negotiating with the Biden administration about the JCPOA. I mean, what the what the hell do they think they're doing? Anyway, but I just think that we were talking earlier about Machiavelli. I don't think Machiavelli would say, yeah, I think it's a good idea to have a, a state run by clerics. I don't get nuts. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all your questions and comments and criticisms and everything. Really appreciate that. Sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather with this gray, dark coldness here in Budapest. So thank you, everybody who have contributed to the tip jar. I have to deal with those savage hounds tomorrow, and you know how unsympathetic they are. Well, I've got a cough. Well, yeah, I always have a cough, but I make no excuses. That's the way they talk. So anyway, thank you, and we will be back on Thursday, the same time. Till then, all the best. Good night. Bye-bye.